Hi, everyone. Welcome to Emmett's weekly webinar this week on the U.S. Israel Saudi relations. Obviously, given the war in Israel that was launched by Hamas this past weekend, the topic of our discussions will be tied directly into the ongoing and devastating attack. But I did want to share with you also that tomorrow we're going to be holding a special webinar at, it was originally scheduled for noon. It's now going to be at 3 p.m. featuring retired Israeli Brigadier General Amir Avivi, providing us with a live update on the status of Israel's war with Hamas and on the IDF's response to the genocidal attacks by the barbaric terrorists. I'm very, very honored to have Dr. Michael Makovsky with us today. Mike is the president and CEO of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, known to most of us as JINSA, a leading Washington, D.C. based policy and educational organization focused on U.S. defense and national security issues in the Middle East. Mike has worked extensively on U.S. Israel defense ties, U.S. policy towards Iran, Syria, Iraq, Gaza, the Persian Gulf, and the role of energy in U.S. national security policy and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I urge you all to follow his work. You can follow him at www.jinsa.org. So we are limited on time today. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get to audience questions because we have a lot to cover, but I did want to jump right into this. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you.
I want to start, the topic was supposed to be the Trilateral Normalization Agreement among the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, which was something that could possibly consolidate major strategic partnerships in a way, transforming the security architecture of the region, while also potentially locking out the Chinese, which is, I think, a very serious strategic consideration. Most of the analysts who I have been following agree that the timing of Hamas's launching of this war was at least in part intended to derail a normalization agreement that appeared to be getting much closer to fruition. Before we get into some of the details of the proposed deal, what impact, if any, do you believe this war will have on the completion of such a normalization agreement? I mean, I'm hearing some high-profile folks state that the war has definitely upended any ongoing discussions between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And it seems to me that if Israel actually does what's necessary, I think that would make the Saudis even more inclined to join with the strong horse in the region. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, like everybody, I'm sure, like you, everyone in the audience are, really glued to our computers and then TV to watch all the time what's going on. It's just been an awful thing going on in Israel, obviously. I think it's a good question. And my own view is that you're right, that on the one hand, it could make the, it could slow or postpone a little bit or for a pause, maybe is the best word, the efforts on normalization. But I still believe that I still think, when you have all the three parties, the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia, they clearly have made this strategic decision for this to happen. I think it's likely, I think they're going to resume that effort. Obviously, as you point out, the war is going to complicate things, could make things a little tougher on the Saudis. Certainly they weren't, I know you don't want to get into all the details about what the agreement is yet, but obviously if you got Palestinians getting killed or something, even if there's a reason for it in Gaza, because they massacred so many Israelis and took a hostage and wounded so many more, it could make it tougher for the Saudis for sure. On the other hand, I think MBS has made a clear decision. This is what he's important. I think he realizes that, at least it's my understanding, that he appreciates that it's probably easier to happen under Biden because the antipathy to the Saudis is stronger among the Democrats than it is among Republicans. So if you have a Democratic president, especially one that, refer to the Saudis as a pariah state and where the relations were so terrible. And obviously the administration, in my opinion, I'm sure you agree, really messed this up. They did the exact opposite. They approached the Saudis exactly the opposite as they should have for a while, but they got religion for whatever reason. Is it the political calendar or whatever it is? And they want to have a victory, and it would be a big one for them. I think they see it's in their interest to do it, and I think the Saudis have made it abundantly clear. Obviously, well, I think MBS was on Fox News. He was pretty explicit about it. My organization, we met him last November about it, and he communicated his views to us. It was clear he wanted to do this under certain conditions. So I think it will pause, but I don't see it yet sideline. I don't think it's going to sideline it, for now. That's how I see it as of things stand today. Of course, it's a very fluid situation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope you're right. I mean, one of the issues, I had heard the agreement was on the 2-yard line when Trump was in office, and it was when Biden came in, and he did, view the Saudis as pariahs and sort of pushed it on the back burner. But now that he's back in it, all in it, whether it's for political gain or not, he's inserted the Palestinians into the negotiations, which they weren't part of it when Trump was in office. So now we've got the Palestinians who are, Israelis are being asked to make all sorts of concessions to the Palestinians. Hamas's war has obviously changed the calculus of where all of that comes out. I mean, my first thought is, who are the Palestinians to have so aggressively and confidently inserted themselves with all of these new demands that they're making that are completely unrealistic on Israel? And to the extent anyone thought that a two-state solution was even possible, October 7th certainly has changed that calculus. So do the Palestinians, do you see a role that the Palestinians are going to eventually play if this does move forward, or how does the war change the Palestinian, the need for concessions, I guess, by the Israelis?
It's a good question, and you're right. Certainly when we were in Saudi Arabia last November, so it's almost a year, it was clear that it wasn't the Saudis' interest, to do the Palestinians. That wasn't one of the conditions that they had shared with us. The Saudis, it was all about U.S. Saudi relations. It wasn't really so much about Israel. Now, maybe realistically, you're going to have something about the Palestinians, but that wasn't what they mentioned. We explicitly asked them that, and they made it clear that that was a separate issue for them. So I think was mostly been injected, as you say, by the Biden administration. It's a shame because, it's hard for people to break out of bad habits, and the habit, not, on the left, but I would say even on the right, is just kind of conventional wisdom by many in Washington. So you had to do some on the Palestinians, right? And the Abraham Accords should have exploded that, myth, at least as things stand today. Now, maybe years ago that would have been the case, but that's not the case in recent years. I remember Ron Dermer was now the Minister of Strategic Affairs, and in between being he was ambassador, I'm sure everybody knows, for 7.5 years to Washington, but then he became Minister of Strategic Affairs at the end of December when they formed the new government. But in between his government stints, he was a distinguished fellow with JINSA, with my organization. And, I talked to him about it. I think he also talked about it publicly, that, he told the Trump administration, even before it came into office, and said, there's a possibility for a peace right here, with the Arab countries. They try to communicate that to the Obama administration, but they couldn't believe it. So it's really a shame that the Biden folks, and you got a lot of them populated by Obama folks, that they just keep thinking, oh, we got to have the Palestinians. And I don't think they just think it because they think it's realistic. They also think it because that's what they think should be the case, because there's so many, particularly more in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. They just, they're just so sympathetic to the Palestinians, and they think it'd be a real shame, you still have people like that. And I think you even have some Republicans like that who feel got to inject the Palestinian issue, even with the Abraham Accords today, with the relations with the UAE. So I think so I think between sympathies and bad habits, it's hard for people to reorient the reality that the Abraham Accord showed. So sorry if that was a long diversion, but I think that it does kind of explain a little of the context here. So now you have the administration that is really injecting this in a strange situation when the Israelis don't want to really think it's important, and the Saudis don't really think it's important. But the U.S., the third party, the moderator, does. So to answer your question, and I apologize that I didn't, you could see it playing both ways. On the one hand, you could see what Hamas did because it was so atrocious. And that is, it certainly wasn't helpful for the Palestinian cause in any way. And you could say, a lot of people say, who cares anymore what they think? On the other hand, I think Biden was kind of careful when he spoke. He made it sound like Hamas only represents Hamas, and it's not about the Palestinian issue. So I don't know. On the one hand, there's going to be less sympathy for them. On the other hand, if what Israel goes in, if they go in with ground forces, but even if they just keep pounding Gaza with by air, at some point there's going to be some pictures that are going to bother people, and people are going to say, how could you do peace when this is just going on with the Palestinians? So the short answer of all that to say is I don't know, but I could see it playing out both ways. It could lead to either greater sympathy for the Palestinians and pushing that issue further up, or it could say, you know what, we kind of look at this. We're not going to let this stand in the way of peace.
I mean, I think that the usual suspects are already turning. If you look at headlines in the New York Times, the Washington Post, some UK papers, this spin is already anti-Israel, and of course we had the calls for de-escalation beforehand. So, I just read that actually there's now there's attacks on the northern front. So who knows whether the sympathy with Israel as it's bombarded from all sides, maybe it's horrible.
Yeah, when you said that the initial reaction, you're referring from the State Department, right?
Yeah, but now, we're seeing this. The sentiments are already starting to move against Israel. And so I think that, as you point out, as soon as Palestinian bodies are paraded across the internet, the narrative will change.
Could be. I have to say, though, I think it's worth mentioning, and I know we want to talk about Iran and all this, but I actually think Biden deserves credit and all this, despite, I know you mentioned these State Department tweets, and I think one was from Blinken, but definitely one was at Office of Palestinian Affairs about immediately, which they then deleted, is what you're referring to, de-escalation and so on. And we all know de-escalation in such a situation is like basically surrender. So I think institutionally that building certainly feels that way very strongly about the Palestinian, and I don't think they haven't learned too much from the Abraham Accords. They didn't even want to say Abraham Accords, if you remember, beginning. And I think Barbara Leaf, the Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs, I think in her confirmation hearings, I'm not sure she even used that term. Now they do now. It took them time, but I think they do now. But I see it partly as a bureaucratic thing in that building that's a problem. I mean, but anyway, I think Biden deserves credit for how he's been standing up immediately, foursquare behind Israel. They're already shipping weapons right away. It doesn't, we'll talk about what he messed up, but I think I think on some fundamental things, he's reacted surprisingly well, I think.
Well, okay, so I wasn't going to get into this, but let me ask you a question as you raise this. Where does the U.S. come into play in terms of, now that we found out that there are lots of Americans that have been murdered, that are being held hostage? Israel's never going to have U.S. boots on the ground, and I know that the carrier striker was sent over there, and that looks great, but it's not going to be. We're not going to be attacking Hamas from a carrier striker or from any assets on that. So how does the Biden administration deal with the Americans that are now tied into this?
Right. Well, one thing we have to say is we're not going to give Hamas 1 cent. Those days of the $6 billion ransom payment have to be over. Obviously, the administration isn't going to put it like that, but I think just like Israel is now reoriented, it's had to make adjustments to its policy. I wrote about this in today's New York Post. I think the United States does too. And I think specifically, just to deal narrowly on the hostage issue, I think we have to tell the Iranians, I think we have to hold them to account. There's a question of how much leverage they have with Hamas. But I got to think that if we put the Iranian leadership on notice that we're going to hold them responsible for this, I think they'll have some influence. I whether what we do, we'd have to think about. But I mean, if it was me, I'm not saying this is what the Biden administration would do, because they've been very careful for 2.5 years to avoid any whiff of confrontation with the Iranians. I mean, just to give an example, if I may, to put in context, my organization, JINSA, we track this carefully. There have been over 90 attacks against U.S. forces by Iran or its proxies in Syria and Iraq under Biden. We have retaliated a total of 4 times. 4 times. I mean, it's outrageous. So they've even attacked U.S. forces in retaliation for an Israeli strike because they were afraid of the Israelis. Now, which is unbelievable. The last time I checked, we're the United States of America. We're a superpower. As far as I know, we got a lot of military tools that we could deploy. But capability is one thing, and will and determination is another. And we've shown zero of the latter, even though we have a lot of the former. So I think that they don't want a confrontation with Iran, but I think what they should do is hold the Iranians account and say, look, we're going to hold the Iranian leadership, which means, by the way, I'm just throwing out ideas. Just like Trump, which I think was, one of his most significant moments when they killed Soleimani. Well, maybe you hold the guy that replaced him and you target him, or you make it clear to the Iranians, we're going to get to you, we're going to get to people like that, and we're not going to tolerate any of this. So would that be enough? I don't know, but I wouldn't just hold Hamas to account. I think you've got to make this clear, and I think you have to make it clear to the Qataris, who the United States has been, I think, too friendly with. Qataris are smart, by the way. They played it well. They played Afghanistan very well. They were very helpful in Afghanistan. But look, if you might, I'm sure some of your audience saw that I thought their statement was one of the worst ones that came out by a government. They held Israel solely responsible. That was the language, if I'm not mistaken. Well, that's got to stop. We just designated them as a non-NATO major ally. Maybe we should reconsider that. Maybe we should tell the Qataris we're going to reconsider our whole relationship with them if they don't do everything they can to free these hostages. I think we have to go full out on this. I think, obviously, I think the Egyptians will be helpful, but I think we have to make clear to the Qataris, the Iranians, that it's not just about Hamas here. We're going to hold their leadership accountable. And when it comes to the Iranians, since they were so involved in this awful atrocity, I think we need to tell them that we're going to hold some of their leaders personally responsible for how this plays out.
So Mike, let me ask you something then. In Biden's speech yesterday, there was not one mention of Iran.
That's
and
right.
Of course, there's been a ton of, of people like you and I and others who are pointing out the $6 billion, and you've got Blinken saying, oh, well, not a cent of it has been released and it's for humanitarian aid, but of course we know that money is fungible and they're ignoring that fact. So now we've got, and so the Wall Street Journal had that story, I think it was on Sunday, we've all lost track of time, maybe it was Monday, indicating that, Iran was directly tied into these attacks, was training, gave the green light the Monday prior to actually for Hamas to proceed. And yet the Biden administration is still saying we have no evidence of that. And in fact, this morning, the New York Times published a piece in which the administration is saying that early intelligence shows that Iranian leaders were surprised by the Hamas attack. What do we make of? I mean, it doesn't seem to me that Biden has any interest in bringing Iran into this, because I think that Biden still wants to pursue a nuclear agreement with Iran.
Well, that could be one of it. They might have, it seems like they might have already concluded an understanding with the Iranians on their nuclear program anyway, that might have been part of the deal with the $6 billion. We don't know for sure, but that's based on reports for months. That's what it seems like has happened. I just think this administration, a nuclear agreement or not, it's funny. Well, it's not funny, but it's odd to me that I don't know why the United States has felt so spooked by confrontation with Iran. By the way, it's not this administration just. I mean, by the way, Trump did virtually nothing on the ground against the Iranians except Soleimani. Now, that was a huge thing to do, and I give him a lot of credit. It was gutsy for what he did. So he needs to be, we need to recognize that. But aside from that, before that, he did nothing. And I mean, they were hitting ships. They attacked that Abqaiq in September 2019, one of the most important energy facilities in the world. It's in Saudi Arabia. We didn't retaliate. Remember when they downed the drone in June of 2019, and then at the last minute, literally, like within like the last 10 or 15 minutes when they were going to retaliate, he held it off. He said he didn't know there might be Iranian casualties, which obviously was preposterous. So, in fairness, this isn't a partisan thing. I don't think Bush did very much, even though Soleimani was killing our soldiers in Iraq. Reagan didn't do much after the Marine. He did nothing, as far as I know, with the Marine base bombing that killed 250 Marines.
Clinton as well.
What?
Clinton as well.
Yeah, Clinton. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to skip over that, but
Yeah.
I was just highlighting some unfortunate big ones. I think that the United States, for reasons I don't fully understand, has been scared of confrontation when the reality is the Iranians are afraid of confrontation with the United States. When we made it clear that we mean business, I think they back off correctly. They're not stupid. I don't think they're irrational people. They're very impressive, frankly. So but I don't think it's just a nuclear thing. I think they just don't want confrontation with the Iranians, period. As I mentioned, 90 attacks on our soldiers, and we retaliate 4 times. I mean, and even when we retaliate, they're so pinprick, and we try to avoid any casualties. And I mean casualties, I mean by the terrorists. And we issue a statement by the Secretary of Defense, like Austin, or by the Pentagon, I don't remember, but it came from the Pentagon building, that was so careful about, we want very proportionate response, we don't want escalation. I mean, who are they kidding? They're certainly not scaring the Iranians. So I think they just don't want a confrontation with Iran, period.
So you brought up a couple things. You meant, we're talking about the nuclear thing. One of the demands or requests on the table with the Saudis is that the Saudis want a civilian nuclear program, supported by the U.S. with permission to domestically enrich uranium. So does the U.S. risk setting off a new nuclear arms race in the Middle East if that plan proceeds? And would Israel actually even agree to that? I mean, it seems to me that, Mohammed bin Salman even said to Brett Baer in that interview that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, so will they. What are your thoughts?
We heard that too last November, so it wasn't a surprise. He said exactly this. I mean, he told us the same thing last November. He said they get one, we're getting one. That's what he said. And frankly, I don't blame him, honestly. If I were him, I'd want one too. By the way, I hope he doesn't have one, get one. I'm just saying I can understand it. But you're right. I think if I may, there's basically 3 or 4 main conditions. And you brought up I think that one of the biggest ones. So one is he wants some security. And this is what they communicated to us. And I think they have basically stayed the same within some reason. He wants a security arrangement with the United States. It's now understood it should be some sort of mutual defense pact of some kind. He wants a steady supply of weapons. He doesn't want diplomatic spats to interrupt things as a supply of weapons from the United States. Obviously, all this is U.S. Third is what you mentioned, the enrichment. You mentioned domestic enrichment, nuclear enrichment. And then the 4th issue then is the Palestinian issue, which really I don't think came from them, but came from the United States. So I think the Palestinian issue could be finessed, but it's a tricky one. And we talked about earlier, we'll see how this plays out with this war. On the nuclear enrichment, I think it's a challenge. And I think you brought up exactly a big problem. If they get it, what do the Turks do? What do the Egyptians do? Is it really in our interest for this to happen? Could there be compromises? Could there be some things done here in the United States and some facilities there? I mean, people have been talking about this. I'm not as expert on what those things are as much, but people are talking about, obviously talking about control. They talking about like a nuclear Aramco, but look how Aramco played out. They took over the whole company. So we don't want that. On the other hand, if we say no, they could always go to France. And I mean, MBS has been pretty smart, to say the least. When we were in Saudi, it was last November, it was after the OPEC Plus meeting, when the U.S. and the Saudis were at each other about it. I thought the administration was completely wrong. I was sympathetic with the Saudis. And now he's completely turned things around. And I think one of the ways is because he plays the China card very well. And he's done a good job of that. So if the U.S. doesn't do it, could they go to China? And why wouldn't they? Or France even? So I'll tell you, I would, and you asked about Israel. Look, the Israelis would rather not, but they're also aware that, and I think Dermer might have said this publicly, it's possible they could go to other countries like China and France, and then the U.S. wouldn't have as much control, and there wouldn't be that normalization. Is that a good situation? It's hard for us to say, because I think I think Biden needs to put it directly to MBS and say, look, I'm willing to give you a mutual defense pact. Isn't that enough? I mean, is it really necessary that you have this? Because this is going to be a real problem for us. If he says, look, this is fundamental to me, I can't rely on the United States, that's a great treaty, but still it's not good enough. Then maybe there are these other compromises that could be worked out, where maybe some of the enrichment is done here, but the facilities are there. Certain things could be done. I don't know, or they purchase uranium enrichment elsewhere. Actually, from Russia could be one bizarre case. But I think nuclear experts have been playing with this, so it's possible that could be resolved. But I would strongly prefer that we wouldn't agree that there'd be nuclear enrichment, in Saudi Arabia. It's not just about the Saudis. It's not just about what happens if MBS gets knocked off. It's about, as you point out, it's the implications for proliferation also.
So before, excuse me, you've mentioned the Mutual Defense Pact, and I just want to touch on what that would mean. We're going to talk about JINSA's proposed treaty with regards to a mutual defense pact between the U.S. and Israel in a second. But with regard to the Saudis' request for some sort of, is it like an Article 5 NATO type of defense agreement that they're looking for? And would that have, for instance, deterred the Iranian attack on the Saudi Aramco facility in 2019 if something like this was in place? That's
an excellent question. The challenge with them is, and I know, as you said, we'll talk about what an Israel treaty would look like. The Saudis, they don't have a motto of we defend ourselves by ourselves. When we were in Saudi Arabia, I directly asked them, yes, it's true, it's terrible. The U.S. didn't help you at all when Abqaiq was hit in September, and, which is major energy facility, which frankly surprised me. And my understanding is there wasn't even serious consideration to do anything in retaliation by the United States. But it's also their country. Why didn't they do anything? Because they were afraid to get their clock cleaned by the Iranians. They're very risk averse. They know they have a lot of these expensive military toys, but they haven't known how to use them well. I think to MBS's credit, I think they realize that now. They know that for a while now, and they realize they have to have serious readiness militarily. They can't just have expensive planes. They have to know how to use them, and they have to be prepared to use them. I don't know, I think it's a very good question, and I don't have an answer to that. I don't think the United States would probably want to be in a position of, let's say they get things start up with Yemen again, with the Houthis. Are we going to get involved in, they're getting hit by drones? I wouldn't think so. To me, I think Article 5 with NATO and with all the other treaties that we have, and we have treaties with 52 countries, including NATO. The language is usually like attack or major attack. So you could argue Abqaiq is part of that, but I have to think that we'd want to raise that threshold a bit, because I don't think we really want to get involved in, every time the Saudis get hit. So that's something they have to figure out, is they have to do something that's strong enough to act as a deterrent to Iran, but not be a low enough threshold that it gets us involved in things that we shouldn't be getting involved in. I personally think it's understandable for something like Capcake, which is such a strategic target, but in Saudi Arabia, I could see how that could trigger such a treaty. But then you could say maybe lower level drones don't, I think they'd have to play with that, but you could make some have to distinguish between major strategic targets and threats and lower level ones, I think.
Okay, so let's then turn to your JINSA report that was issued in late July, which was entitled "U.S. and Israel Display Combat Capabilities, but Deterrence Against Iran Still Deficient." And the conclusion in that was, basically the United States appears to be trying to increase its deterrent signaling towards Iran, but, quote, such activities are not enough to convince Tehran that America has a willingness to act itself or support or support its Israeli partner in acting against Iran's nuclear program or regional aggression. I mean, so presumably the Mutual Defense Pact that JINSA has drafted between the U.S. and Israel and is put forth as a response to that recognition that so far it's just not enough.
Right.
Hamas's war against Israel supports the bottom line, which is that America has not sent a clear and unambiguous message to Iran and its proxies that we unconditionally stand by Israel. I know we're saying it now, but if we had perhaps something in place or spoken more, a little differently prior to now, I don't believe that this would have happened. And then I just want to quote John Hanna, your JINSA colleague, who stated on a webinar recently, the United States needs to think big and go big as part of this major geopolitical transformation that we are now engaged in trying to negotiate.
Yeah.
So can you explain to our audience the motivation behind JINSA advancing such a historic and game-changing mutual defense pact with Israel? And do you think that the U.S. is ready to go big?
I think they could go big, actually. So let me just for a second. So the report you mentioned in July, so that was our no daylight paper. Our point was how to think about how the U.S. should respond if Israel attacks Iranian nuclear facilities, and we argue that there should be no daylight between the United States and Israel, because the more daylight there is, the greater chance Iran would retaliate in a more extensively and more intensely. But the more the Iranians see that the U.S. is behind Israel, the more muted their response would be. That was what we argued there. The report that the treaty idea you point out, so we first put it out in 2018. We put out then a report and a treaty in 2019. The Israelis, came to us after we put it out. It came from a task force of retired U.S. generals and admirals that was chaired by Jim Stavridis, former NATO commander, Admiral Jim Stavridis. And the idea was there should be a mutual defense pact, but only in exceptional circumstances. We put out a treaty then. Bibi and Trump tweeted about it in September 2019, and then Netanyahu had all these elections that he had to deal with, and COVID, and then it got kind of sidelined. Once we knew that Netanyahu was coming back to power, and also Dermer, by the way, and I know he was very into it, we knew it was going to come back. So we started working on a new treaty, an updated treaty in paper. We think the Ukraine war shows that treaty alliances with the United States still have a lot of importance, even when I think American credibility is relatively low, like it is today. Look how fast Sweden and the Finns and Finland wanted to get into NATO after the attack on Ukraine. Russia hasn't touched any Ukrainian country, any NATO countries. So we believe from a U.S. perspective, treaty alliances actually are a contributor of stability. And we think it's particularly important as we're trying to retrench from the Middle East. We have treaty alliances, I said, with 52 other countries, but none with the Middle East. And interestingly enough, it's the most volatile region probably in the world. So we think that actually a treaty alliance, but only in exceptional circumstances where Israel's very existence is threatened, that's what would trigger it. Israel wants to defend itself by itself. We think we have a very important obligation to supply them with weapons and allow them to defend themselves by itself. So that treaty would never have to be triggered. But if Israel is going to be threatened by weapons of mass destruction, have its very existence threatened, we think there should be We think that that would actually activate a treaty. We think the very existence of the treaty itself would act as a deterrent to Iran, and maybe that's what you were referring to. Certainly on the nuclear side, it might prevent them from actually crossing the nuclear threshold. We think the Iranians are very keen on perceiving whether there is daylight between Israel and the United States. And again, the more daylight they perceive, the more aggressive they're going to be. So we also think, but in a worst case scenario, we think it could be actually an extra layer of deterrence to Iran actually, God forbid, trying to do something that would threaten Israel's existence. We think a treaty would elevate the bilateral U.S.-Israel security relationship for decades. And the way we've devised it, we'd have a 25-year MOU. The current MOU expires in 5 years between the two countries, which is an MOU for defense assistance between the two countries. But we think the treaty alone would also, because we have language in there that would also guarantee that the U.S. provides weapons to Israel, prepositions weapons in Israel, a U.S. stockpiles, which we've been arguing for years, and wouldn't it have been nice if there already was that already, but that thing has been depleted, which we've been arguing against for a long time. So we think the treaty would be a significant moment for the bilateral relationship. But going back to what you mentioned about my colleague John Hanna idea about going big, if you were going to do a treaty alliance with Saudi, and we think you have to then have also a second pillar, and that would be a treaty alliance with Israel. And we think that could help create a security architecture very favorable to the United States. I actually think this administration, in our dealings with the administration, they've been very receptive. Doesn't mean they haven't said yes yet. Biden and Netanyahu spoke about it last month. It's been reported when they met in New York in UN week. This came up. Biden didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. They're open-minded. They're talking about it. So I still believe this was proceeding. I think we saw it as part of a Saudi normalization. It would have to be Senate confirmed for both treaties. But if we think it was kind of presented somewhat like a package, that would bring a lot of peace to the region, we think you might get more Republicans and more Democrats to support each treaty. You need 67, so you have to get both parties to support this. Most likely, more Republicans would support a treaty with Israel, and more Democrats. Actually, more Democrats would probably support a treaty with Israel too than they would with the Saudis. But because it's a Democratic president that was presenting it, you're going to get more support from Democrats than, let's say, if it was a Republican president. So I do believe, I felt this way before this war started a few days ago. There was a great moment for this. I still think it's possible. It just might get delayed a little bit.
Do you think that this war maybe would make the Biden administration, first of all, more inclined to support something like this? And, I believe wholeheartedly that you've got to cut the serpent's head off, which means go after Iran. So do you think also that this war will eventually, I'm assuming Israel is able to defeat Hamas, but do they have to turn to Iran and cut the serpent's head off? And would the U.S., with or without this treaty, do you think at this point, given what we've seen, the atrocities we've seen, support something like that?
First of all, I'll say, the resistance to a treaty has been the idea of it's been the military leadership. But here you have a prime minister now. And by the way, my understanding, Ben Gurion wanted such a treaty with the United States early in Israel's existence. The idea of leadership generally has been resistant to this more than the U.S. side. That's my understanding historically. The interesting thing, one of the reasons for the resistance, that the idea of leadership worries that a treaty could tie their hands. On the U.S. side, you would see resistance to it because they would think it would give Israel a blank check to attack Iran and so on like that. So it's kind of funny. Each side fears the exact opposite happening. We don't think it will tie Israel's hands for various reasons, and I don't think it would be a blank check either. But it could require more consulting between the two countries. First of all, a war with Hamas wouldn't trigger a treaty in our view at all. And I'm not even sure, I don't even think a war with Hezbollah would. Getting to your point about hitting the head of the snake, It's a very good question. My own view, basically, the Israeli government has two major considerations now. Do they really want a ground war in Gaza when they historically have been averse to such a thing? And what do they do about Iran? How could they not do something with Iran when the Iranians seem so much involved in this? Though we don't know completely how much yet, but it seems like it's been significant. There's another option. Israel could go after Hezbollah. That's another option, which would also hurt the Iranians. I think they have to do something against the Iranians. Whether they want to do it now or they hold their fire, let's say for the sake of argument, I don't know. Let's say for the sake of argument, as predicted, they go in with ground forces in Gaza. As many expect, not predicted, but as many expect will happen. Then after that, and at some point do they then turn north? Because ideally they wouldn't want a war on both fronts, on the north and the south. So they wouldn't want to do it simultaneously. The fear is, of course, that a ground war in Gaza could really bog them down for a while. It also could cause a lot of IDF casualties. And actually, one could argue, isn't that what the Iranians really want? Don't they want Israel to go in like that? So I don't know. I think they have to deal, as you say, with the head of the snake. They want to do it if they do it with their timing, when they think the timing is propitious. I also believe they're going to have no choice but to attack Iran nuclear facilities at some point. I think that they have no choice but to do it. But now they're going to have another reason to hit the Iranians, because they're going to have to say, I think their biggest challenge now today is restoring deterrence. They've been humiliated. This has been a disaster. It's inconceivable to any Israeli, to anyone in the region, to any of us. How could this have happened? That, 1,500 or whatever, or I don't know how many Hamas terrorists came in, killed all these Jews and non-Jews, but mostly Jews. I mean, just in cold blood, babies, we all know, I won't go into it, it's just awful. And Israel doesn't, and nothing, and it takes the IDF so long to respond. They have to restore deterrence. So I think what they do is guided by that. I think they know that is what the most important thing is. So if that requires them to go in by ground troops with Hamas, in their view, that's what they're going to do into Gaza. I'm worried about them getting bogged down there, because I agree with you. They're going to have to turn north at some point, whether it's the Hezbollah or certainly at Iran. I don't think they could allow the Iranians to keep doing this, and that they step their back, like in a sanctuary there, untouched. They'll have to do something. The question is what the timing is. I agree with you. They're going to have to do something against the Iranians just because of this. I also think they're going to have to do something at their nuclear program also.
Michael, I know you had to end at 12:45, so unfortunately I'm not going to get to many of the questions, and they're all really good questions, and I appreciate everybody submitting them, and I'm sorry about our time crunch today, but Michael, I can't thank you enough. I know you're quite busy in the midst of all of this horrific stuff that's going on right now. But thank you for joining us. I thank you all for your support of Emmett. Please continue your support. We could not do this work without you. Please share the word about the work that we do, and JINSA as well. You do great work, Mike. And I can't thank you enough for joining us. Everybody say a prayer, peace, safety for all of our Jewish, non-Jewish people in Israel that are under attack right now in a horrific way. Thank you. I wish everybody a good afternoon.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye.